Good afternoon. You can all hear me? Okay, I speak Canadian, so if you have a problem understanding me, just put up your hand. Hey? Okay, what I'm going to do this afternoon is give you an overview of my office. It's a relatively new office. As you'll see, it was created in 2008. And then focus in on alternative dispute resolution specifically. Now, there's no logic or rhyme or reason to my presentation, so feel free to ask questions because you won't be interrupting anything. Okay, I'd like to start my presentation with a story that I quite enjoy. It's about the American astronaut John Glenn. Everyone's heard of John Glenn. He was the first astronaut to circle the Earth. And when he came back to Earth, the journalists, much like yourselves, were in the audience asking a number of questions. And one very smart journalist asked, geez, Mr. Glenn, you were sitting in that capsule waiting to blast off. What was going through your mind? And, you know, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this is going to be spiritual. This is going to be religious. He's going to meet his maker. And John Glenn said, well, he said, I couldn't help but sit there and think, this damn thing's been built by the lowest bidder. Only procurement people understand that joke. Okay, so let me start by thanking Dr. Tellis, my fellow presenter Ellen, and Professor Dermott. This is quite a unique opportunity for my office. We usually get asked to speak within our nation because we're a relatively new office, and a lot of suppliers and industry associations want to hear what we can offer, but very rarely are we asked to go overseas. So I thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully you'll get something from this. Let me give you a bit of the Canadian context just to situate you how we work. We're a former colony of Britain, so we work under the Westminster parliamentary systems. We have a House of Commons, although one of the two bicameral bodies is sort of useless. We've been trying to get rid of our Senate. That doesn't really do anything. There are a political party with the largest number of elected members forms the party, and that head of that party is the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister selects a cabinet, much like in Britain, and those cabinet ministers in Canada are considered to be ministers with portfolio, so they're MPs with portfolio. Generally, a portfolio is a government ministry or department. The public service, unlike the U.S. system, is professional. We're lifers, as we like to call ourselves in Canada. We're to be nonpartisan, and our role is to provide fearless, unpartisan advice. We're expected, we have a code of conduct, we're expected to follow highest standards of accountability, transparency, and efficiency. Now, as a result of a recent legislation, a Code of Conduct Act, we can be dismissed if we don't follow some of these things. So that's the political system. Public procurement, federal public procurement, this does not take into account provincial and municipal procurement, is the fourth largest federal expenditure. So you can see transfer payment to provinces, personnel costs are paying our bureaucrats and our national debt. These are Canadian dollars. Canadian dollar is roughly equivalent to the American dollar right now. And Pedro and I calculated earlier, it's about 1.4, the exchange rate on the pound is about 1.4. So if you put procurement in there, it's 15 billion, which depending on the time frame is anywhere between 1% and 2% of our gross national product. So it's an economic driver. Federal procurement is an economic driver in Canada. Of that 15 to 20 billion that's spent annually on procurement in Canada, that's spent using approximately 385,000 contracts. So on an annual basis, the Government of Canada issues 385,000 contracts. This doesn't include, I think you call them frameworks, we call them procurement vehicles in Canada, so supply arrangement, for common commodities. It's excluded from these 385,000 contracts. And of the 385, 92% are what we consider to be low dollar value contracts. So 355,000 of these 385 are low dollar value contracts. In Canada, a low dollar value contract is considered a contract under $25,000 Canadian. Pedro and I calculated, I think it's about 16,000 pounds. And that represents roughly 1.5 billion of the 15. So what this is telling us is the vast majority of our contracts are under 25,000. So the volume is below 25K. The value is above 25K. So the value of our contracts, the dollar value is primarily around military procurement, large procurements. We have, as I was mentioning to Ellen earlier, quite a legislative framework that governs our procurement. It's, if you speak to some of our bureaucrats, it's perhaps too regulated, but let me walk you through the roles and responsibilities. We have a Treasury Board of Canada, the Secretariat, which is the central administration arm of government. They're responsible for establishing procurement policies and authority limits. So every government department will have an authority limit, thresholds that they can spend. Those are set by a central government management arm called the Treasury Board of Canada. Then we have the Department of Public Works and Government Services, my former department. They are considered to be the central purchasing arm of government. So they do such things as procurement, centralized procurement, and real property management, amongst other things. They do our pension. They're the central revenue collection group for government. But essentially, the Department of Public Works is responsible for central procurement. While the Department of Public Works is responsible for central procurement, the Treasury Board has delegated some of the responsibility for procurement to over 100 departments and agencies. So virtually every government department and agency in Canada can purchase within their legislated thresholds. So the Minister of Public Works has delegated financial and procurement authority to her colleagues within certain limits. So it's a highly decentralized procurement process, even though Public Works is supposed to be the central procurement arm. Then we have Justice Canada that provides legal advice, and the reason I've put this on the slide is that in Canada, whenever there's a court decision, it adds yet another layer of complexity to our procurement system. And we have the Canadian International Trade Tribunal, which is the CITT. It examines supplier complaints, much like my office, but I'll get into their area of responsibility in a minute. And they look after trade agreements. And then we have the Auditor General of Canada, who's a parliamentary officer, and he is responsible for doing audits that audit on the federal procurement system and other federal operations, and he reports to Parliament. So a bit on our regulatory framework. There are more than 15 acts, and I've listed some of them here, that govern federal procurement in Canada. Some of the more interesting ones, the Federal Accountability Act, I'll get into a minute. Public disclosure. In Canada, there are two elements of public disclosure that I want to share with you. There are several, but the two are that government departments are required to post public tenders on a system called MERX, M-E-R-X. And if you were to Google that, what you would find is every government procurement tender, both at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. So any supplier wanting to do a purchase of chairs, or any department wanting to do a purchase of any equipment would post that requirement on MERX, and any supplier can go online and apply for that. At the back end of the public disclosure is something called the proactive disclosure requirement, and in Canada, every government department is required to publicly post the award of any contract above $10,000. So while low dollar value contracts are considered to be under 25, the law has gone beyond that, and any public contract below 10,000 or above $10,000 is to be publicly posted. So if you were to go on any government department website, Agriculture Canada, Corrections Canada, on the left-hand column, probably typically at the bottom of the left-hand column, you'll see something called proactive disclosure, and there you can see what government contracts have been let by that department, along with the expenditures of the senior bureaucrats and politicians. And there are more than 35 policies to be considered. The bottom line of this complex framework is the contracting in Canada is founded on the concept of competition. There are very few exceptions to contracting in Canada. We're required by the government contracting regulations to compete. This is the slide that talks to you about these exceptions to competition. A pressing emergency, and the government decides whether there's a pressing emergency, not the bureaucrats, although typically it's based on the recommendation of bureaucrats. Here's our valued under $25,000, and I'll focus on that a little bit more as the presentation goes along. Not in the public interest, sort of wide open. It's, again, subject to government decision as to whether it's not in the public interest. And then the last one, only one vendor capable of performing a contract. This one is an area that my office has taken particular note of. Our sense is that it's not, the policy that surrounds this exception is not well articulated. And if you go onto our website, we have several reports that talk about the ambiguity of this exception. To give you an example of this, any government department, I'll give you a case in point actually. One of my staff was looking through Merck's, the government posted website where governments post their solicitations. We do this on a fairly regular basis to monitor what's going on. Within Merck's is a section that advertises what we consider, what we call ACANs. ACANs are Advanced Contract Award Notices, which is what this is all about. So when a government department decides that only one vendor is capable of performing, they have to issue an ACAN, publicly post an ACAN. And that Advanced Contract Award Notice is supposed to test the market to ensure that the bureaucrat has in fact not made a mistake, and that there is in fact only one supplier capable of supplying this. About a month ago, we noticed that our federal police agency, the RCMP, the gentlemen that you see and women that you see on horses, had posted an ACAN in one of our western provinces for drones. They're getting into drones now for various things. And we noticed that the specs were highly suspicious. They looked like they were targeting a specific supplier. So we called the office that was putting this ACAN out, because once the ACAN is expired, once the 30 or 90 days is expired, that department can sole source purchase from the supplier. And by having posted the ACAN, the thresholds that I spoke about earlier are no longer in existence. They can go beyond their thresholds. So one of the things that we're suspecting is a lot of people are using ACANs to go around their delegated thresholds. When we called the office, lo and behold, the next day the ACAN had been pulled off the site, and the response we got back was it was a mistake, we're reviewing it. So one of these two are the ones that we seem to focus on the most. All right, so let me talk to you a little bit about my office. I have to give you a bit of history. Starting in, I think it was 1993, the Liberal government were elected, and were doing, by all accounts, a marvelous job. But if you recall back in the late 90s, early 2000s, we were having a bit of a constitutional problem where one of our provinces, the province of Quebec, the separatists had started to make a little more noise than they needed to, and there was threat that they might split the country up. And the Liberal government, this is Paul Martin, our second Liberal Prime Minister, his predecessor, Jean Chrétien, decided that we needed to do a little bit of marketing with our provincial, Quebec provincial colleagues, and put in place something called the sponsorship program. And the sponsorship program, in a nutshell, was supposed to be a series of advertisements and a series of, you call them propaganda sort of campaign to convince the Quebec population that they were benefiting by being part of our country. That's a very abbreviated version of the program, so don't quote me on that. But that's essentially what it was supposed to do. Around early 2000s, a gentleman by the name of Alan Cutler, who worked at Public Works, who was managing this program, discovered that there were issues with the program, that certain suppliers were being giving contracts, and there's no evidence of work coming back. He tried to get the attention of the senior bureaucrats, couldn't, so he went to the media, and that's when things blew up. And in our country, the use of public funds is sacred, and politicians live and die on their reputation for the management of the public purse. So without getting into too much more detail, Mr. Martin, our Prime Minister at the time, was forced to call an election. He had lost the confidence of the people. He called an election. And lo and behold, in 2006, he was defeated, and the Conservatives came into power on a platform of cleaning up the corruption of the Liberal government. Part of that was the Federal Accountability Act, and it had a number of elements embedded that strengthened ethics, put new truth in budgeting. I won't get into it. If you want to know more about the Federal Accountability Act, I think there's 3 slides at the end of the presentation that get into detail. The important one, the pertinent one for today, it was the establishment of my position. My office isn't recognized under a law, my position is. So the establishment of a Procurement Ombudsman. That was in 2006. It took 2 years to get the office operational. So let me talk to you a little bit about my office. So that's sort of the history of how my office came to be. It was a main pillar of the Federal Accountability Act that the newly elected Conservative government promised to the populace to clean up the mess that they had inherited from the Liberals. We were a main feature of the Accountability Act. Prior to 2008, prior to our creation, suppliers had limited recourse mechanisms for low dollar value contracts. So as I mentioned earlier, if you were a supplier of high dollar value contracts, you could go to the CITT, the Canadian International Trade Tribunal. If you fell below that threshold, unfortunately, you had 3 choices. You could try to take up the issue with the department you were dealing with, and good luck in Canada dealing with the federal bureaucracy. You could hire a lawyer, and hiring lawyers, probably the same here. I'm in a law school, aren't I should. Very expensive and very time-consuming. Billable rates are quite high in Canada. Sorry, Pedro.
I'm a former lawyer.
Oh, I know. That's why I'm apologizing. You've seen the light. You've come to our side. And this was the case for a lot of suppliers in Canada, they just walked away. They chalked it up to the cost of doing business, and they said, fine, I'm having trouble, but I'll swallow that and move on. So that was no. The second one was there's no third-party mechanism to resolve disputes. So if you got into a real heated issue about the administration of a contract with a department, again, there's no way of resolving it other than going through the legal route. And then finally, the one that puts a different slant on the title ombudsman is this one. There's no dedicated body for oversight of federal procurement activities. So as I mentioned earlier, the Auditor General in theory has a mandate to do that, but he is looking at so many other types of government operations that he never really looks at procurement specifically unless it's for the review of the F-35 purchase that's going on in Canada, or the review of military helicopters. So prior to 2008, prior to the creation of my position, these were the gaps. So we were created as an independent organization with a government-wide mandate. You recall that earlier I said there were 100 plus department agencies. There are very few of those that I'm not allowed to review. A couple of examples, House of Commons, the Senate, and CSIS, which is our secret intelligence police force, sort of the CIA equivalent in Canada. And I operate at arm's length, so I'm an independent office. I don't report through any government department, but I do report to the Minister of Public Works. And I'm part of her portfolio. It's a female minister, Minister Rona Ambrose. I'm part of her portfolio, but I'm not part of her ministry, her department. Now, this one usually raises eyebrows. I spoke to a group in Washington in the last fall, the Organization of the Americas, and the vast majority of the 3 questions I got, that was a joke, were around my reporting relationship. How on earth they thought that this was contradictory. How could I be a reporter at arm's length when I in fact report to a minister who is the minister of a central purchasing department? Well, in fact, I have to acknowledge, and I'll grant you that optically does look like an issue, but operationally it hasn't been a problem at all since I've started. My only requirement is that I produce an annual report. The regulations require me to produce an annual report within a certain number of days after the end of the fiscal year, and she is required to table it in Parliament. She has no say or no influence on my day-to-day activities or any of my reports. So while it looks like there may be a conflict, in reality, to date, there hasn't been. I was asked on at least 2 occasions in front of parliamentary committees how on earth I could claim to be independent when my boss was the boss of all procurement in Canada, and my response was, well, if there was an issue, you, ladies and gentlemen, would be the first to hear about it. I would make an issue of a minister trying to influence my work. And anyone who's known me would know that that's very true. This is the bottom line for my office, and we use this as our calling card. We're neither lobbyists for suppliers nor apologists for federal departments. Very important for us. We promote this on an ongoing basis. Our mission is to promote fairness, openness, transparency in federal procurement. I don't know what the hell that means, but that's our mission. I'm not sure how do you measure this? But that's our mission, according to our regulations. Obviously, a bureaucrat wrote that. Our mandate, okay, so here's what we do. We review complaints respecting 1, the award, and 2, the administration of contracts. So a supplier, any Canadian supplier, can phone my office or write to me on our website and complain about the award of a contract below the thresholds that I mentioned earlier. Or if they're currently working with a government department and there's an administration issue, they can complain on the administration of that contract. There's no dollar value there. If that complaint falls within the parameters of my regulations, I do not have the discretion. I must review that complaint. And we do quite a detailed analysis. I have my own legal group that double checks the analysis that's been done by the investigators. And it's a very formal process because I want to be able to demonstrate that I've met the requirements of the regulation. So the paper trail is very, very detailed. The second one is the review the practices of government departments for acquiring goods and service. And in this element of my mandate, my regulations require me to have reasonable grounds. I cannot go into a department on a fishing expedition suspecting something is going wrong. I have to establish reasonable grounds. And the last is provide alternative dispute resolution services. So let me stop there because my presentation gets into ADR quite heavily, given the subject of this session. Are there any questions around those two before I move on? Now, I have to tell you, I was speaking to Ellen and Pedro earlier, this one runs, in my humble opinion, a little bit counter to the role of a traditional ombudsman. This is a federal auditor reviewing. You're not helping anyone but the Canadian taxpayer by doing this. And I've gotten letters from law firms that have been hired by suppliers pointing that out to me. You know, quoting the genesis of the ombudsman theory and what they're supposed to do. This one also causes politicians a bit of heartache and gas at times. If you were to Google Procurement Ombudsman Canada, you'll get a series of a dozen or so articles that were written last week on a report that I issued on the Canada School of Public Service. I received allegations that 2 senior managers were manipulating contracts. We went in, that's reasonable grounds, that's all I need is to have that documented evidence. We went in, reviewed the practices of the Canada School, and sure enough, we found that the contract process was being manipulated. Essentially, the way the issue unfolded is that a fairly senior manager at the school hired a financial advisor and using the $25,000 clause managed to cut the contracts just slightly below that and then hired a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth time. In Canada, that's a no-no. You're establishing employee-employee relationship, which is not allowed under contracting. So essentially, we found that the allegations were founded. We have journalists, the media in Canada that monitor our website. I'm required to post our reports, so when they see a report like that, it takes off like wildfire. We had headlines. The minister responsible for the Canada School is subject to the review. In order to diffuse the situation, I think if you read the newspaper article, he promises to take the most severe action possible against the 2 managers. Again, politically trying to diffuse the situation. Okay, when a supplier calls us, they're often frustrated. A lot of this comes from a lack of understanding of how the procurement process works in Canada. I'm not sure what it's like in the UK or your countries, but in Canada, the private sector, a lot of the private sector still does business the old-fashioned way, a handshake, and that's all they need. When you get into the federal procurement process, a handshake is a greeting in Canada, and then you're handed a stack of paper. And they don't understand that. So when they call my office, it's typically because they don't understand the process. And occasionally, they want answers. Part of the government contracting regulations in Canada require that when a contract has been let, a contract has been awarded, the other suppliers that bid on that contract but were unsuccessful are required to have a debriefing. We still find that some government departments, a debriefing is essentially to let these unsuccessful bidders know what fell short in their bid. Not why the winner won, but what fell short in their bid. What we're finding is a lot of government departments are either apprehensive or not willing to do this. In my view, as I've said to in my annual reports, we need to take extraordinary efforts as government departments to educate unsuccessful bidders, because we want the pool of suppliers to be as large as possible. And if we're not debriefing unsuccessful bidders, we're losing people who would otherwise be playing in the federal procurement system. And if we reduce that pool, we reduce competition, and it has the potential for increasing prices for taxpayers. So in virtually every one of my reports to date, I've talked about debriefings because I feel it's a very important aspect of procurement. So when we get these calls, our role is to first and foremost listen. So I didn't get into our business model, but I'm one of those very impatient people that when I phone a telephone company or a bureaucracy or a cable company, I don't want to be put from one person to another, to another, to another. I want the person who answers the phone to deal with me until my issue is addressed. That's the business model we've put in place. So when you phone our office as a supplier, the person that answers the phone will stay with you until the issue is disposed of. And I use the phrase disposed of because we can't always resolve issues. We can dispose of them, but not always resolve. But the first thing we do is listen, because typically these suppliers have had it. They're exasperated, they're frustrated, they're at times angry. And for those of you who have been married more than 2 months, you know that the best approach there is just to listen. Let them vent. I call it let them unpack. Let them unpack. Unpack it. Don't say anything. Let them unpack. I've been married 33 years. I know how that works. The next thing we try to do is be helpful. So as they're unpacking, we're making notes, and if it has to do with a supply arrangement or sole source contracting, we're bringing up the information, and we're able to then start explaining how things work. In some cases, we point the office in the right direction. Now here's a case where the word ombudsman often gets the attention of the general public. For example, we had an elderly couple from Guelph, Ontario, a small town, who were having trouble receiving their pension. Something had happened with their pension. These poor people were almost destitute the way they were explaining it to us. My instruction to staff is deal with it. I don't want to be pushed from pillar to post. I don't expect people like that either. So whether it's in our mandate or not, we try to get that assistance to the individual. What I've said to parliamentary committees is, if you want to criticize me for that, if you want to reprimand me for that, fill your boots. I consider it to be good use of taxpayers' funds, even if it isn't in my mandate. I'm willing to take that risk. And we facilitate whenever possible. So let me talk to you about facilitate. Our goal is always informal resolution. So if we can try to resolve it informally, we will. And what we do is these three things. We, first of all, dialogue is paramount. Talking people through the system, making them understanding their perspective. Shuttle diplomacy, occasionally just telling that person what's going on or what's supposed to go on doesn't resolve the issue. We then have to contact the department or obtain additional information from the department. Bottom line is we try to de-escalate. We don't want this to develop into a formal complaint. Not that we don't want to deal with a formal complaint, but it's probably the least effective method of resolving the issue for us. Now, if everything else fails, this is where our alternative dispute resolution service comes in. And this is typically an issue around the terms and conditions of a contract. Now, our process is voluntary and consensual. So what this means is it can be requested by either party to the contract, but the other party can decline it. So the supplier might want ADR to resolve the issue. The government department might say, no, we're not interested. There are clauses in our contract that deal with that. We want to exhaust those clauses. When that happens, I have no recourse. The department can walk away, and I don't have anything in my regulations that force them to come to the table. It's a very quick service, and there are no fee for our service. So if I do manage to get the government department and the supplier to agree to an alternative dispute resolution process, it happens fairly quickly, the time that it takes to organize a meeting. The discussions at these sessions are without prejudice, so we have a pre-session meeting with both parties to see where the middle ground might be, and try to discover whether there's any room for us to work with. Now, I know I'm in a very academic area here, so I'm going to quote an academic when it comes to alternative dispute resolution. And you might want to Google this earlier. The philosophy we use is one that was used by a very astute person. And the phrase is, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you might find that you get what you need. It's Mick Jagger. That's our philosophy for ADR. I made that up. It's a boring 4.5-hour train ride here. Okay. Now here's the key for us. The results of this session are confidential and legally binding. So if we do manage to get an agreement between the two parties, it's confidential and legally binding. Courts will recognize that agreement. Our experience to date, it's avoided lengthy and costly litigation, very much less time consuming. There's no service fee, which, remember, our primary clients, the 92% of the contracts that are let in Canada are by SMEs. In Canada, that's small and medium enterprise. We also call them, the pedestrian term we use is ma and pa shops. Less than 5 to 10 employees. So very appealing to small business. Minimal risk to both parties. And of course, if you can get a legally binding agreement, that's all the better. The key for both sides is that it's confidential. And what we work for as an ombudsman office is to preserve the business relationship. That is important because, as I mentioned to you earlier, suppliers in Canada are, in a lot of cases, distrustful of government. If there's an issue, a lot of them are more likely to walk away and never do business with the federal government than they are trying it again. So when we do these sessions, our unwritten objective is to preserve the business relationship. That's all I had. Now, I tried to be very quick so I didn't erode on my fellow presenters' time, but and I can get into a lot more detail in certain areas if you'd like, but I'll stop there.